Hello there. I'm continuing with my World War I theme, and our topic today is going to be the end of World War I, something called the Treaty of Versailles. You recognize that word right there? Okay? One blank piece of paper, here we go. Outstanding. Okay, so the Treaty of Versailles, ladies and gentlemen, basically is the peace treaty at the end of the war. So let's discuss the end of the war. So one of the things that we're going to talk about, we're going to kind of go back to the Russians and the Russian Revolution that goes on. This is a big part of this whole deal, is that basically the Russians will drop out of the war in October of 1917. And this is good for Germany, because as you recall, when we discussed the Schlieffen Plan, we realized that Germany's problem was fighting a two-front war. Now with Russia out, they can just fight a one-front war. And so now this allows the Germans to attempt a big, huge push to try to win the war once and for all. Well, we have learned, haven't we, that offensive tactics are not working in this war at all. And so even though this is a huge offensive, they really try to push that line of trenches in France, try to push it back. They're unable to do so because defense has the advantage in this war. Something else happens, okay, we just learned about this. The Americans are starting to arrive. So the Germans, they get the Russians out, they try to make this big push to win the darn thing because they kind of know the Americans are coming, and once the Americans come, the Germans understand that this is going to be a numbers problem. They're going to have a numbers problem, and that's exactly, basically, sort of, if you will, what happens. So into 1918, really into the summer, here's a term for you to learn. The Germans agreed to what is called an armistice, okay? And now, what is armistice? That is technically a suspension of hostilities, okay? A suspension of hostilities. A truce, if you will. This is not a surrender. This is a truce. And so this occurs on November 11th, 1918. And they actually have a time that they do this. The war officially comes to an end. It's agreed on both sides. It's going to come to an end at 11 o'clock in the morning on the 11th day of the 11th month. So 11, 11, 11. All right? Now, there's something else you probably should sort of recognize here, and that is that, hopefully you recognize this, is that November 11th in the United States is Veterans Day. And this is why Veterans Day is chosen. And if you notice, Veterans Day could be on a Tuesday, a Wednesday, a Thursday, or whatever. They don't move that automatically to Monday. Veterans Day is always on the 11th. Now, if the 11th is on the weekend, you get Monday off. But hopefully you recognize that. Sometimes I like to refer to that Veterans Day holiday as, and what it was originally known as, Armistice Day. Okay? So the Treaty of Versailles, as you should probably recognize, was done at the Palace of Versailles in Paris. And as a matter of fact, it was signed officially on June 28th, 1919. Now, maybe you recognize June 28th, maybe you don't. June 28th, 1914 was the date that Ferdinand and his wife Sophie were assassinated. So it was the people that did the Treaty of Versailles wanted to have it done on that day for the symbolic reason. Okay? Now, who ran the darn thing? Mostly, and I brought his name up before, it was mostly run by the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson. He sailed, I think, he sailed for sure. He sailed to London and was greeted as a hero. They had huge parades for him. Then he sailed over to France and went to Paris. They had a big parade for him in Paris. He was seen as the guy who really helped bring the war to an end. The other two prime ministers of France and Great Britain, one was named Georges Clemenceau, very French name, and then the prime minister of Great Britain is a guy named David Lloyd George. And so Wilson had some basic ideas about how he thought this whole thing should go down. But I'm going to tell you, Clemenceau and Lloyd George, they had their own sort of thoughts as well. So on some things they were together, but there are other things that Wilson didn't really grasp that the British and the French were thinking about. And so that's not necessarily hard to blame the guy. Okay, so here we go. What is Wilson's principles going into this, I'd sort of say there's three things. I'm going to sort of talk about three things that Wilson wanted and three things that the British and the French wanted. The first thing that Wilson wanted to talk about was something that he called self-determination. And this was sort of his argument. And this is sort of a very much an American kind of concept that people should be able to govern themselves. That's exactly what the United States of America was founded on. The desire of these colonists of North America to govern themselves, not dictated by the British, way back in 1776. Okay, so Wilson's argument is, if you just let those Serbians govern themselves, then that Serbian guy wouldn't have assassinated that Austro-Hungarian guy, and we wouldn't have had this big mess and all these millions of people killed. If they just would have, the Serbians would have just been able to govern themselves, this all would have been fine. He believed in something called peace without victory. Now, what does this mean? This means trying not to punish the Germans. Maybe you recall the Congress of Vienna. One of the big things about the Congress of Vienna was that the French were not punished for the acts of Napoleon. The French were actually invited to the Congress, the peace treaty. The Germans were not, I can tell you that right now. He wanted to have a fair settlement with the Germans. We're going to discover that the British and the French were not interested in that. So here's the thing that I would say you should know more than anything about what Wilson wanted was something called a League of Nations. Now, this should sound familiar. It sort of sounds like United Nations, doesn't it? And the United Nations is an international congress that exists today. And it is based on this concept. The first attempt at a United Nations was this thing called a League of Nations. And so basically, Wilson was of the mindset that if you have this thing, this Congress, that these kinds of disputes can be dealt with, disputes between nations can be dealt with at the League of Nations, at the United Nations, if you will, and then you avoid war. So in other words, if Wilson believed that if a League of Nations would have existed, okay, if a League of Nations would have been around, then the Serbians and the Austro-Hungarians could have talked it out in that forum, in that format, as opposed to going to war with each other. All right? So that's the idea behind the League of Nations. All righty? The Allied principles. So this is basically what I'm saying. This is what the French and the British wanted. Well, they were like, okay, that's all well and good and that's fine, but we have some other sort of thoughts. And that is this idea that we want revenge. And this is the main thing that the British and the French are interested in. There is actually a part of the Treaty of Versailles. It is called Article 231. And Article 231 basically is written out in the document that says that the sole responsibility for this war should be placed on Germany. And so if you remember my discussion way back at the discussion of the dominoes falling, look, the dominoes could have stopped right there with the Germans. The Germans had nothing to do with it. They had no interest beyond, they had nothing to do with Serbia. They had nothing to do with that, okay? So this is basically the argument that they're making, the British and the French are making, okay? And so because it's Germany's fault, guess what the British and the French want? They want to get paid. So they want to get paid for the reparations, meaning they want everything that like France, everything that was destroyed in France, they want it paid for. They want they want stuff to be paid for that was broken. They want to get paid for compensation from the loser. Germany had to pay for war damages, and I can tell you that they did pay. The Germans paid for a long time, even after World War II. They continued to pay war damages. All right? And then the third thing is that there were secret treaties that had been made. And these secret treaties were set up to basically, okay, so now I got to go back and have you think about imperialism in Africa game, okay? And so, look, Germany is one of those nations that had made colonies worldwide as well. Germany's got colonies around the world. Well, the British and the French, okay, had already had a secret sort of deal going about how they were going to divide up Germany's, they're going to divide up Germany's holdings. And this little doodad right here was set up before Wilson ever even arrived and stepped foot in Europe. And so Wilson didn't know about it, but it was in the Treaty of Versailles. Okay? All right, so now, as this is all said and done, as we go through this, what is the importance of the Treaty of Versailles? Okay, and by the way, maybe I'll sort of let me say something about the Palace of Versailles in just a moment. Germany was not invited. Okay, and this is a thing that we've kind of learned, right? This is different than the Congress of Vienna. France wasn't punished; they were invited. Germany was not invited; they were punished. They're not invited, but they're forced to sign. It kind of reminds me of what Hitler does to Hitler and the British and the French do to Czechoslovakia in Munich in 1938. They basically divide up Czechoslovakia, and Czechoslovakia wasn't even invited to the discussion. So Germany is forced to sign it. Maybe you remember they signed it in the back of a railroad car, and Germany feels embarrassed. They feel slapped in the face. And this is an old discussion about how you started a duel with somebody. Gentlemen started a duel. They'd wear gloves. They would take off their gloves, and they would slap somebody across the face twice with their gloves to embarrass somebody. Okay, an embarrassment. And look, Germany's economy is ruined, and this is sort of one of the very first things that starts the Great Depression. Okay, so that's something else to keep in mind here. The Great Depression is going, and this is going to be sort of the start of it right here. All right. So, what is sort of some of the long-term things? Give me about 2 minutes.
Okay.
Let me give you a couple of things here. The United States is going to revert back to isolationism, and I'm going to give you another write-it-down period about the long-term effects of World War I, and this will be one of them. The United States is going to revert back to isolationist. The United States never joins the League of Nations. The League of Nations is in the treaty, and maybe you all know, you should know this, a treaty, the United States is only officially a part of a treaty. A president can negotiate treaties all they want, but treaties have to be ratified by the Congress. And what happens is the United States Congress never ratifies the League of Nations. The League of Nations is set up, but nothing ever happens. The United States never joins. The Germans are forced to rebuild in order to fix their economy. And this is where we can go right back to Herr Hitler. Young Adolf, of course, we know, was a trench runner during this thing. The last point I'll sort of make here is ultimately we would have to argue that the treaty is a failure, because we're talking about it's signed in 1919, full-blown World War II is full-blown and going by 1939, a mere 20 years later. Quite different than the 99 years we discussed with the Congress of Vienna. Just a couple of points. Point number one, this thing, when they had big meetings, they had it in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. The private individual meetings were in the palace, but in the smaller rooms. But whenever they had something major to do, when everybody met, they met in the Hall of Mirrors. Hope you remember that. The second thing I would say is that Wilson has a stroke once he gets back. President Wilson he takes trains all around the country trying to convince people to convince their congressmen to join the League of Nations. And he has a stroke on that trip. He actually has a stroke while he's in Colorado, my home state. And really he is basically physically incapacitated for the rest of his presidency. Many people said his wife, and this woman happened to be his second wife, sort of ran the country while he was incapacitated. So that's a little story about that. Okay? So these types of stories have to do with the end of World War I. I have one more WITP that is going to be World War I focused, and you will get that in the next one. Okay, everybody? I hope you enjoyed the discussion of the Treaty of Versailles. Hope you remember all those terms, Palace of Versailles, etc., etc. Okay, and that's it. And remember, even though I'm not here, I'm still here.